Okay, so we're just going to do a quick intro. The agenda for today. First of all, we've got the introduction to the NCDS and what's new in the age 55 survey, and that'll be with Matt Brown, the NCDS survey manager. We then have Brian Dodgeon, the CLS research fellow, talking about how to access the data. Then he'll be talking about documentation available. Then we have Tarek Mostafa, the CLS research officer, talking about the NCDS sample, including issues of non-response and attrition. And then Matt will be concluding the day with using the mixed mode data from the age 55 survey. And then we'll have some questions. If you do have any questions during the actual presentation, I'll be copying and pasting them onto a Word document from the chat pane. Let me just show you where the chat pane is. The chat pane is sort of down here to the left. I can't really, sorry, let me change the pointer. Down here to the left. If you can write any questions you have there, we'll try to address them after each individual presentation. I'm now going to hand you over to Matt Brown. Let me just give him the microphone.
My name's Matt Brown. I'm the survey manager for NCDS at the Centre for Longitudinal Studies, and I'm going to start off the webinar today by giving you an introduction to NCDS, telling you a bit about the origins of the study, its purpose, what is covered in the study, and then provide some more details about the most recent sweep of the study, the age 55 survey, which took place in 2013. So the NCDS is run by the Centre for Longitudinal Studies. We are part of the Institute of Education, which has recently merged with UCL and become a faculty of UCL. At CLS, we also run 2 other birth cohort studies, and we also run the Next Step study, which was formerly known as the Longitudinal Study of Young People in England. So we're funded as a resource centre by the Economic and Social Research Council, the ESRC, and so we're basically here to provide a resource for the academic community, and we've recently been awarded funding for the next 5 years. So Britain has a long history of birth cohort studies, and NCDS is actually the second in a series of studies that began as far back as 1946. And so although many countries now have birth cohort studies, there are no other countries in the world that have studies going back as far as we do. There are 3 birth cohort studies which are based here at CLS, of which NCDS is the oldest, which began in 1958. We also run the 1970 British cohort study and the Millennium cohort study, which began in 2000. And so you can see that there is a 12-year interval between the first of the 3 studies, so 1946 to 58, 58 to 70. Then there was quite a large gap between 1970 and the 2000 when the Millennium cohort study began. But then there's more recently, the live study has recently begun last year, so almost replicating that 12-year gap. And in many senses, the Next Step survey, which we also have recently taken over the running of here at CLS, can be thought of as filling the gap between the 1970 and 2000 cohorts. Because that study, although it hasn't followed people from birth, started at age 14 and is following a group of individuals who were born in the early 90s. So the birth cohort studies all share some common characteristics. They're all fully representative of the GB or the UK population. NCDS and BCS70 are both based on 1 week's birth, so in 1958 and 1970. The MCS is based on births which were spread over a whole year in particular areas. All of the studies are also very large and started off of around about 17,000 babies. And they all aim to follow participants from birth into adulthood with the broad aim of seeking to understand how experiences and circumstances at one stage of life have an impact on achievements and circumstances in later life. The studies are all very much multi-purpose and multidisciplinary, and as we'll go on to see, they cover a huge variety of topics, and importantly, they are there as resources for research and policy communities. So the data from the studies is made available for researchers via the UK Data Service, and Brian's going to come on and tell you more about how to access that data shortly. And the data is really the data from all of the studies are hugely valuable resources which allow researchers to examine a full range of issues, and this slide gives an indication of the kinds of questions which can best be answered by cohort studies. So they're particularly well suited to looking at questions to do with the long-term outcomes of experiences and decisions in early life, and also more medium and short-term outcomes and links between different aspects of people's lives, such as their health and their employment. Following people over time allows us to create descriptions of individual trajectories in terms of people's careers or relationships, their journey in and out of poverty and disadvantage. And the fact that we've collected information in these studies from multiple generations, so collected information from parents as well as from the study members themselves, allows researchers to look at how advantages and disadvantages can be transmitted from one generation to the next. And the studies can also, because of the fact that there are multiple studies, we can use the data from the studies to examine social change and compare experiences of one cohort with the experiences of other cohorts. So coming on to talk about NCDS more specifically. So began in 1958, as I've said, as the perinatal mortality study, and its initial focus was to investigate factors which were associated with mortality and well-being amongst newborn babies. It then subsequently went on to become a longitudinal study, which has tracked individuals now for almost 60 years. So the first follow-up took place in 1965 when the cohort were aged 7, and then again in 1969 at age 11. And these early childhood sweeps monitored educational, behavioural, emotional, social and physical development, and the links between this and conditions during pregnancy and birth. The cohort were then tracked through school, and as they made their transitions into adult life, so information was then collected about how they went on to form their own families and their entry into employment and then their subsequent employment trajectories. And basically, each stage is sought to collect information relevant to the particular stage of the life course which the cohort has reached, and to examine links between their present situation and the pathways that they've trodden to get to that point in life. So this slide gives you a broad overview of the types of information that has been collected by the study over the years. So from the birth survey through to age 16, the core interviews took place with the cohort member's parent, and that was typically the mother. The cohort members themselves did begin to answer questions at age 7, but became the core respondent at the age of 23. Over the course of the study's life, information has also been collected from school records, from teachers, from medical records. There's been medical examinations, and the cohort members have sat various kinds of tests and assessments also. And then at age 33, the children of half of the cohort were given assessments which were very similar to the assessments which the study members themselves had taken in childhood, which allows researchers to look at intergenerational transfers of ability. This slide shows how the number of people participating in the study has changed over time, and Tarek's going to say more about this in his presentation, which is coming up. But you can see that the study began with just under 17,500 babies being involved in the birth survey. And this has gradually fallen over time. So in the remaining childhood surveys between 7 and 16, around about 15,000 participants took part in each. And then in the more recent surveys, which have taken place from 44 onwards, we're down to around about 9,500 participants. And so people have fallen out of the study for a variety of reasons. So people have refused to participate any longer. We've lost touch with people as they've moved. People have moved overseas. And so there are a variety of reasons why the numbers have fallen. Most of the sweeps, the yellow bars on this chart, have involved face-to-face sweeps, so participants have been visited in their homes. The age 44 survey was a biomedical survey which involved a nurse visiting the cohort members in their home, and I'll give you a bit more information about that shortly. The age 46 survey was a telephone survey, and the age 55 survey was a mixed mode sweep which involved web and telephone, and I'll say a bit more about that in my final presentation at the end of the webinar. The next sweep will take place at age 60, and that will be a face-to-face sweep again. And we hope that the numbers participating at age 60 will increase a little in comparison to the most recent age 55 survey. In terms of the topics covered, I mean, this slide gives a really broad overview of what we've covered over the course of NCDS, but it only really skims the surface, really, as huge amounts of data have been collected over the course of the study's life. The birth survey was very medically focused, but over time the scope of the study has really broadened to cover all aspects of life. So throughout school, information was collected about family circumstances, parental employment and financial circumstances, the child's housing situation and their health, and also their parents' health. The teachers provided information about the child's behaviour at school, as did the parents provide information about child behaviour. Lots more information was collected from teachers about the child's ability and also their personality and various different aspects of their childhoods. And information was also collected directly from the children about what their views were and what their expectations were about how their lives would pan out, so that we can compare how their lives actually did pan out with their expectations during childhood. And then during adulthood, information has been collected about the cohort members' own family circumstances and their employment. Lots of detailed information about income and housing trajectories, lots of information about health and qualifications and other kinds of training which people have done, information about cognitive ability, and lots of information about people's attitudes and their values and how these have changed over time. So, I mean, there's a lot of repeated content from year to year to allow us to measure change, but also each sweep has typically had new questions which are particularly relevant to the stage in life that the cohort have reached. So as I mentioned, the age 44 survey was a biomedical survey which involved a nurse visit to the cohort members. So that was quite different to the other sweeps so far. Obviously very much focused on health. With the broad aim of the biomedical survey was to obtain objective measures of ill health. So many of the sweeps have involved collecting subjective information about health, but the nurse visit actually allowed us to actually do a broad range of actual measurements and assessments. So the nurse did a series of physical measurements, standing and sitting height, weight, waist and hip measurements, blood pressure and pulse rate, lung function. Blood was collected also from which has now been used to collect a whole range of different assays, and DNA was extracted also from blood. Vision assessments were conducted and hearing assessments. There's a very detailed psychiatric inventory conducted also, and saliva was collected as well. For early morning cortisol, which is a marker of stress. The timing of the surveys is carefully planned also to foster cross-cohort comparisons, particularly with the 1970 cohorts. So there are now 4 time points at which the cohorts can be directly compared, most recently at age 42. The next sweep of the 1970 cohort will take place at age 46, so that will be another sweep which will allow direct comparisons with NCDS. Also, the next sweep of BCS 70 at 46 will involve a biomedical element too, so that will allow comparisons of health with the NCDS biomedical, which took place at age 44. So just to give a few examples of some cross-cohort comparisons, these are all based on childhood health. So we can see that there was a marked increase between those who were born in 1958 and those who were born in 1970 in terms of the percentage whose mothers smoked during the time that they were pregnant. We also see that there was a huge reduction in the proportion who were breastfed, and a huge reduction as a result of the much more widespread vaccination program, a huge reduction in the number of children who had had measles by age 10 or 11. So you can see some really significant differences between the two cohorts born just 12 years apart. Just to give you a few examples of some findings which have come out of NCDS specifically. So researchers have found that poor school attendance and truancy is associated with problems in adult employment and marital breakdown. Being bullied at school has been found to have long-term psychological and other effects right the way through into mid-adulthood. The amount of interest shown in a child's education has been shown to be a significant predictor of their attainment at school. Economists have done lots of research looking at wage returns and shown that there are substantial increases in wage returns associated with attending higher education. And researchers have found that periods of youth unemployment can have a really long and significant detrimental impact on people's subsequent wages. A few more findings, these mostly related to health. So psychological problems in childhood have been found to have substantial long-term economic and social consequences. This has been found to be primarily, in terms of economic consequences, a lot of this is related to the fact that people who've had psychological problems in childhood have gone on to be less likely to be in a relationship as they grow older, so no benefit from a dual income, and also much more likely to have had long spells of unemployment. Researchers have found that mothers who smoked during pregnancy were more likely to have children with low birth weight, but also that the impact of smoking during pregnancy went on much longer, and so by age 16, the children whose mothers had smoked during pregnancy were shorter and also had poorer ability in maths and in reading. Breastfeeding has been associated with a reduced risk of heart disease in adult life, and chronic lower respiratory tract illness in adults is associated with poor home circumstances in early life. So coming on to talk a little about the age 55 survey specifically, the most recent survey, which took place just over a year ago now. So in terms of the context of this survey, and we know that the mid-50s can be a time of great change for people. So when we last spoke to people at age 50 in 2008, most were in employment, but we know that by 60, around about a third of men and half of women are no longer going to be working. So we know that there are likely to be two groups who are most likely to be exiting from the labour market during their 50s, and those are those who are most well off, who can afford to retire early, but also those who have got particularly low incomes, who are forced to stop working because of poor health. The 50s can also be a time of great change in terms of family circumstances, so it's a time when lots of people's children will be leaving home. It's also a time when the NCDS cohort are starting to become grandparents themselves, and also losing their own parents. In terms of their own health, then at 55 we would expect disease and ill health to still be reasonably rare, but poor health will be starting to rise now. In terms of the content of the age 55 survey, there's a considerable focus on updating the event histories which we've collected over the course of the study's life. So in terms of household composition, children, housing, economic activity and qualifications and training. We know that caring responsibilities are a significant issue for people in their 50s. So we've got quite a detailed block of questions about the amount of help and care provided to parents and to grandchildren. We've collected information about people's earnings, income and also housing wealth. Obviously the 50s is a time when people will be starting to think about retirement, so we've got a series of questions about people's retirement plans and their pension arrangements. Self-reported health and health conditions, and smoking and drinking, and then some questions about well-being. And I just wanted to give you a few examples and some very early findings from the age 55 survey. So as I mentioned, caring responsibilities are an important issue for people in their 50s. And we found that 2/3 of the cohort have some form of caring responsibility. And you can see from this chart here that many have overlapping multiple caring roles. So the most significant caring responsibilities are towards parents and in-laws. So around about half provide some form of care to their parents or to their parents-in-law. And in addition, around 1 in 5 provide care to grandchildren. Those who do provide care to grandchildren are often spending quite a long time doing so. So on average, those providing care to grandchildren are spending around about 8 hours a week doing so. And we found that caring responsibilities can have quite a significant impact on the cohort members themselves. So we found that those who were spending more than 10 hours a week caring for others typically had poorer health themselves and poorer well-being. And just a few findings related to health in the mid-50s. So the first chart in the top left corner shows how people's self-rated health has changed since they were 50 to 55. So we can see quite a significant drop here in the proportion who were describing their health as excellent, from 19% at age 50 down to 14% at age 55. Coming over to the right here, we see that amongst both men and women between the ages of 42 and 55, we've seen large increases in the proportion defined as overweight or obese. And the increase between 42 and 55 is particularly great for women, although men remain considerably more likely to be overweight at 55. And in terms of smoking, we see that the decline in smoking that we've been observing in previous sweeps has continued, such that at 55, less than 1 in 5 men and women now smoke, compared to around about 40% at age 23. In terms of the future of the study, then the age 55 survey data is now available at the UK Data Service, so we would encourage you to download that and take a look at in a bit more detail about what is covered and see what you think might be useful to you. In terms of the future surveys, then the next sweep of the study is going to take place at age 60 in 2018. That's going to involve a face-to-face survey, as I said earlier, but we're also seeking additional funding for the age 60 survey to allow us to do more detailed, objective assessments of health and capability and cognitive function again. And so if we're successful in obtaining this funding, then the age 60 survey will once again involve nurses visiting respondents in their homes, and we'll be able to repeat quite a lot of the measures which were conducted at age 44, plus some additional measures as well. But this will allow us to assess changes in health between midlife and early older age. So that's basically all I was intending to cover in this first session. I've just brought up a picture here of the CLS website, www.cls.ioe.ac.uk, which has lots more information about NCDS and all of the other cohort studies that we run here at CLS. Brian's going to show you a little more about the CLS website shortly, but I would encourage you to access the website to look in a bit more detail about if you've got any questions about what's been covered by NCDS or any of the other studies. So I've been noticing that there's been quite a number of questions coming up in the chat pane, so we're going to try and answer a few of them now. Any that we can't answer right now, we'll make sure that we respond via email to the individuals who've asked those questions.
One question was, when would it be another biomedical survey to compare Matt's already in?
That's right, yes. The next biomedical study will take place at age 60, funding permitted. So fingers crossed on that one.
Another question was, when was the age 55 data released? It was released in March of this year, just 2 months ago.
That's right. Okay. Okay, so we've been asked the question, have sweeps of NCDS been linked with other longitudinal or other survey data? So we have collected consent at the age 50 survey to link the data collected from cohort members with health records and also with economic records held by the DWP and the HMRC. As yet, we have not actually managed to conduct the linkage, but we are currently working on a project to enable this to happen. And so, with a bit of luck, linked health records first will be available at some point in the not too distant future. We've been asked a question, is there any information collected on dietary intake, such as foods and nutrient intake? So we've the biomedical study at age 44 collected a reasonably detailed information about dietary habits, and some information has been collected about diet in other sweeps also, but we have not done. We've never actually been able to do a kind of full dietary diary, which would allow people to actually work out nutrient intake, but this is something that we might potentially consider going forward, and this is something that we are including in the forthcoming sweep of the 1970 cohort at age 46. Are these data sets anonymized? Yes, indeed they are. The data sets contain no personal information which would allow individuals to be identified. All of the data sets available at the archive have a unique identifier which can be used to merge data from the various sweeps together, but there's no personal information included in those data files. We've had a question, is it paid, by which I presume you mean are the cohort members paid to participate in the study? in which case the answer to that question is no, they're not. We've never provided an incentive to a financial incentive to participants to take part in NCDS. We rely solely on their goodwill, and it seems to have been a successful strategy so far. How do you capture the diseases of interest? So most of the health information which we've collected so far has been based on self-reported information. So there's always been a health module in every adult sweep where we run through an inventory basically of various kinds of illness and disease and ask people if they've suffered from those problems in the time since they were last interviewed. But obviously, if we were to be successful in linking to medical records held by the NHS, this would allow us to get at GP diagnosed illnesses and diseases, which would be much better. Do you capture inflammatory markers and sleep, etc.? So yes, there's as I mentioned, bloods were collected at 44, and various assays of the blood have now been conducted, and the results of those assays are available in the biomedical data set, which is available via special license from the UK Data Service, and there are various biomarkers associated with various. So C-reactive protein is one of them. That's right, yes. And yes, and information has also been collected about sleep. So at age 50, we had a fairly detailed series of questions about sleep, and there have been a briefer series of questions about sleep in some of the earlier sweeps as well. If you have any suggestions for questions to include in future sweeps, who would we contact? So you can contact us directly at CLS. We'll show you the website, the email address and other contact details at the end of the presentation, but it will be clsfeedback@ioe.ac.uk for suggestions of that nature. Any questions on owning, buying, renting second multiple properties in NCDS Suite 9? No, not in NCDS Suite 9. I don't know. There's no information about second homes there, but we do have information about total housing wealth across however many properties are owned. But in earlier sweeps, at age 50, I believe we do know about multiple property ownership. What types of documents are available to read with the data sets? So Brian's going to be covering that in his presentation. So I think we'll wrap up there now. There are lots more questions which we'll be sure to answer via email, or perhaps we'll put a document up which answers all of the questions which have been asked on the website, so that you can see responses to your own questions and to everyone else's. So I think at this point I will pass over to Brian, who's going to cover accessing the data and the documentation which is available to help you make use of the data. So thank you very much.
How do I get the next slide? Oh yeah, reduce this one. Thank you, Matt. My name is Brian Dodgeon. I'm a research fellow at the Center for Longitudinal Studies, and I'm going to talk about how you access the data. Can you download it? And the answer is broadly yes, and you get it from the UK Data Service, and This is what the UK Data Service website looks like. We'll be visiting there in a minute. The UK Data Service is a wonderful repository based at the University of Essex, which has stored there literally thousands of data sets from not just the UK, but Europe and all over the world. Our data sets, as Matt was saying, were some of the oldest, and they are the longitudinal data sets, of course, but at the UK Data Service, they have many other non-longitudinal data sets as well. So the first thing one should do is to register with the UK Data Service at that address, and you give details of what you're going to use the data for. And there are different types of access. The standard type of access is the end user license, and that's normal access to anonymized data. Obviously, we will make sure that there are no details on the records available from the data service which allow individuals to be identified. And what you sign when you sign the end user license is an undertaking that you won't try to identify people, for instance, by putting together lots of different variables which there might only be one person who has that particular value in the whole of the UK. There's also a special license for sensitive and disclosive data, including area data, because if you were able to get hold of very fine detail area, it would increase the chances that you could identify that there's only one person, for instance, with 5 children, one of whom died at a certain age in that particular area. So for sensitive and disclosive data, it's important to sign a special license agreement, which your institution also has to sign to say that the data will be treated very carefully. For very disclosive data, you sign the secure access form, and that kind of data cannot be downloaded, and it has to be accessed remotely because it's too sensitive to be in the public domain. And there's a choice of formats for download. You can download the data in SPSS format. SPSS is a very well-known statistical analysis software. It's very user-friendly. It has drop-down menus, and that's probably the most common download form. You can also download it in Stata format. Stata is a more sophisticated statistical package which allows things like structural equation modeling and sophisticated imputation of missing data. And also tab delimited format, which could be read into some other data package. And looking at the age 55 survey, it's important to note that if you download the data from the UK Data Service, we'll be going in a minute to show you how you do that online. It's a series of more than one file. The flat file contains most of the data from the age 55 survey. It was 1 record per case, but there are also a series of hierarchical data sets with multiple records per case. And these deal with relationships, relationship history since the last interview or since 2000, the person grid, so it's got details of the person living with the respondent, so we can get a picture of what the household composition is like. There's also the housing history since the last interview or since 2004, employment activity history, qualification history, a record of all children who have unfortunately died. So that's children who were born alive but since died and not already recorded in the person grids. And then there's this curious file called unfolding brackets, which is really to do with where someone has not given a precise amount to an income variable, but has said that it's probably more than 5,000 but less than 10,000, something like that. So that's included in a separate data set. And there's also a series of derived variables, which is a set of useful key variables which have been constructed from the data, which may be things like social class or ONS, socioeconomic class. And so if we go to the this is it. We now go to the UK Data Service website, and so you need to type in, if you want to look at the data or download it on the UK Data Service, you type in this URL, ukdataservice.ac.uk, and you arrive at this website. Then what you should click is Key Data, because all the NCDS, BCS 70, and Millennium Cohort Study data is classed as key data. And then you get this screen. And within Key Data, you click Longitudinal Studies. And we're now down to the famous British longitudinal studies, the 1970 BCS British Cohort Study, the British Household Panel Study, which has now been relaunched as called Understanding Society, ELSA, the English Longitudinal Study of Aging, Growing Up in Scotland, LSYPE, the Study of Young People in England, which is another data set which we now are in charge of at Centre for Longitudinal Studies. And then there's also Millennium Cohort Study, and here we are, the National Child Development Study. So if you click on National Child Development Study, we get this screen, and it's divided into the normal National Child Development Study data sets and the special license access data sets. So the special license access data sets are the data sets dealing with what people died of, the deaths data set, the biomedical data, which Matt talked about earlier, which was at age 43, 44, and also local authority data. And these are deemed to be too disclosive to just let people have on the normal end user license. But most of the NCDS data since 1958 is available in this category here, the end user license. And if you can see that on your screens, there's about 20 data sets there. And what you'll see is that sweeps all the childhood data, that sweeps 0 to 3, the birth data, the data at age 7, 11, and 16 are all in one longitudinally linked data set there. Then after the childhood data, there's sweeps 4, which also have the examination results, sweep 5, which is age 33, sweep 6, which was at age 42, sweep 7, age 46, sweep 8, age 50, and the most recent one, sweep 9, which was age 55, which just came out in March of this year. And there's also this handy data set here, the response and outcomes data set, which tells you exactly which people responded to which of all of those studies we've just seen. So if we wanted to look at the Sweep 9 data, we click National Child Development Study Sweep 9, and we can explore that to a certain extent online here. We'll look at that in the next little session, which I'll be looking at, which is to do with documentation available. But if you actually wanted to download the Sweep 9 data, you click Download/Order, and then you're invited to log in to the UK Data Service. And at this point, we aren't able to log in during this webinar, but if you yourself wanted to log in order to download data, you click this registration button here, and then you're invited to fill in details of what you're going to use the data for and which data you would like. So now, that's what I was going to say about how to download data from the UK Data Service. We're now going to go on to what documentation is available from the CLS website, and also how to explore the variables. So this is the next session, NCDS age 55 documentation on the CLS website. So what documentation is available? Obviously, when you download data, you do need some guides to tell you how to use the data. And the first thing you need to look at is the user guide. And that has all the details of the survey, how you make sense of the variables available, how they're grouped, and what are the conventions used in coding those variables. You also can get the full questionnaire so that you can see the exact way in which all the questions were asked. Now remember that the age 55 survey was a mixed mode questionnaire, so some people answer the questions online, and so you'll see the questions that were asked to people as they filled them in online, and you'll also see the questions which were asked if the person was interviewed by telephone, because a certain number of people didn't answer it online and were interviewed by a telephone interviewer. And those respective questions are in red and green, so you can tell which is which. There's also the technical report, which shows how the field work was done, how the sample design was worked out, how it was developed, and how the field work was conducted, what sort of response there was in the field work, how many people filled it in online, how many people did the telephone interview, and also the technical report tells you all about the coding, editing, and data preparation. Then, in a minute, we're also going to explore the variables at the UK Data Service, because there's a certain amount of exploration you can do using some very clever software called Nestar, which shows you the frequency counts of pretty much any variable in the age 55 survey, and also in most of the other previous surveys as well. The Nestar software, which we'll look at in a minute, can also be used to do more sophisticated little analyses like cross-tabulations and charts, but you'd have to create a UK Data Service user account first in order to do that. So let's go to the UK Data Service website. Sorry, first of all, let's go to the CLS website. And we type in CLS IOEAC UK. And this is the CLS website, which we keep up to date assiduously. And as Matt was saying earlier on, there's a tremendous amount of information on our website, which enables you to see everything you might need to know about, first of all, the National Child Development Study. You see each of these tabs on the left-hand side bar explodes out to tell you about the 1958 NCDS, the history of the study, about the sample, published work, how to access the data, data enhancements, the data dictionary, and also the surveys and documentation. Now this bottom one, surveys and documentation within NCDS, opens up to show you all of those different surveys, and there's documentation about every single one of those. So for instance, if we want to click NCDS 9, the most recent one, that opens up, and you see now we've gone one level further down, and we've come to questionnaire, technical report, user guide, and data notes. So we want to go to the user guide, we get to this level, one more further down, and you can download that PDF. And so you can do that without registering. Any of this documentation is available free. The technical report, similarly, is available like this, age 55 survey technical report. And similarly, the questionnaire is available here, NCDS age 55 survey questionnaire. So you can see exactly every single question we asked the respondents. Now that was all within 1958 National Child Development Study. If we go back to the home page again, you'll see that not only have we got all that documentation about NCDS, but we've also got it about the BCS 70 study. That also explodes out in all these different surveys, and each one has surveys, has details of documentation within it. And similarly with the Millennium Cohort Study and Next Steps, which used to be called LSYPE. Now, I'm going to go to the UK Data Service to show you how you explore variables using this beautiful Nestar software. So here we are back at the UK Data Service again. So this is at the University of Essex, and you can access this online. And without even creating an account, you can look at the Sweep 9 variables using this little icon here, Nestar. So if we look at the age 55 data in Sweep 9 using Nestar, we now have got, as far as looking at the variable descriptions, which is here. And if you click on this plus sign here, we're within Sweep 9 of NCDS. We're looking at all the different categories of variables. So supposing we look at the flat file data set, and we look at housing within the flat file, it'll tell you all the variables we asked, all the questions we asked about housing. So, for instance, if we click type of accommodation, then the variable name is N9Accom, and we see that 82.9% of people are in a house or a bungalow, 14% in a flat or a maisonette, and so on. And if we look at who they rent the home from, that's variable N9Rentom, and it's 33% local authority renting, 24% housing association, 41% private landlord, and the rest from their parents or someone else. So you can spend a long time exploring variables just through this Nestar software, because it allows you to go as deep as you'd like within any of these categories, and also ask, do you own another property? This was asked earlier by one of the participants today. 24% of people said they did own another property, 76% didn't. And number of rooms in the home, we can tell how big the property is, N9 NUM rooms, and there's a kind of normal distribution as you might expect. And what you can do is, this is very simple descriptive statistics. We can go into tabulation if you are registered with the UK Data Service. So it's not too difficult to register. If you're serious about doing research, you register, and then you're then able to click tabulation, and then you click on one or more of these variables, and you tell it that you want one variable to be in the row of the table and the other variable to be in the column, and you get a nice little cross-tabulation of those two variables. And you can also do charts. But we can't demonstrate that today because it would involve us having to do a registration process, which isn't easy with in the context of a webinar. That's all I was going to say on how to access data from how to access documentation. Do we have any questions that come through? Okay. We're just looking at any questions that came through. Just, does anonymized data comprise the analytical capability of the data? On compromise, yes, I see, yes. No, I would say that anonymized data doesn't compromise the analytical capability of the data, because you can still see the amount of variation there is between respondents, all the 10,000 respondents at NCDS 9. The main point of the research would be to see how much of the variation is explained by all the different variables, and the fact that it's anonymized still doesn't stop you from seeing how much variation there is explained by each of those variables. Which variables in secure access data that are not in the special license data? I would say variables which explain the exact cause of death. For instance, if you could tell the precise cause of death, there are some causes of death which are so precise that only one person in that region would have died of that cause in that particular year. So if you want to look at research looking at exact causes of death, you'd have to come into a secure access environment and then aggregate cases so that nobody gets identified, none of the results that you take away identify that person individually. Another question is, are these formatted data sets having a definition embedded within the variables? Well, the variables are labeled, and the values of each variable are labeled as well, so that I think that's probably what you're thinking about. So you can tell what each value of the variable means, and it wouldn't be too difficult to make sense of the data once you got it. The main problem is that there are a lot of variables, and so it's useful to have the questionnaire in front of you. If you look at if you download the PDF of the questionnaire, the first few pages have an index of what each variable was called corresponding to each question that was asked. Now where did that go? Another question was, is there any separate data set for derived variables, or the derived variables part of the data collection point from which it is derived? Yes, there is, as we saw earlier, the H55 data is composed of quite a few data files, and one of those, the main one is the flat file, which corresponds more or less to all of the questions that were asked one by one. But there's also a file of derived variables, and so in that derived variables data set, there'll be variables which were derived by us later. So for instance, we don't ask people, what is your social class? Are you social class 3 manual or 3 non-manual? We just ask people what jobs they did, and then social class would be a derived variable, and that's still from the same time point, but it's in a separate variable in the derived variables data set. Can we link a data set with another data set in individual levels? We can certainly link data sets from NCDS with other NCDS data sets from different time points. The one variable which has the same name in all the different NCDS sweeps is the variable NCDS ID, which is the anonymized person identifier. So you know that from the point of view of longitudinal analysis, you're linking the same person's data in the past with that same person's data at age 55. Okay, I think we'll leave it at that for now for the questions. And the next session is going to be Tarek Mostafa is going to be talking about missing data.
Hello everyone. My name is Tarek Mostafa. I am a research officer in quantitative methodology at the Center for Longitudinal Studies. And my presentation today will be about attrition in NCDS. So basically I will focus on two main aspects of NCDS. First, the sample design, and secondly, the attrition or the loss of respondents over time. So the sample design of NCDS is fairly straightforward. NCDS follows the lives of all people born in England, Scotland, and Wales in 1 week of March 1958. So this selection of individuals based on the date of birth in 1 week in March ensures the randomness of the sample. So because the date of birth is unrelated to social background, ethnicity, or any other family or background characteristics of these respondents. The target sample was augmented or topped up in the first 3 sweeps, so at age 7, 11, and 16. And we included immigrants who came into the UK, so they were not born in these 3 countries of the UK, but they were born in the same week of March 1958, and they were eligible to participate in the study. NCDS, like in all other longitudinal surveys, suffers from non-response or basically attrition, and this is the loss of individuals or respondents over time. However, we need to make a distinction between 2 types of non-response. So first we have unit non-response, and this is the case where a respondent has been sampled to participate in a study but does not take part, and thus we have completely missing records for this respondent in a particular wave of the survey. The other type of non-response is item non-response, and this is the case where a respondent has participated in the study but did not answer all the questions. And therefore we have some missing records for this respondents on particular items of the survey. In terms of unit non-response, there are different types of reasons or types of non-response. So for instance, we have non-contact. This is the case where the survey agency or the interviewers have tried to establish contact with the respondent but were unable to do so, and for reasons which are possibly unknown. For instance, some respondents have long working hours, they have night shifts, or they live in gated communities and they are hard to reach. And these are the main reasons why non-contact happens. The second reason behind the unit non-response is refusal. This is the case where a respondent is no longer interested in the survey and refuses to participate. There is also inability, and this is the case where the respondent is unable to participate in a particular wave of the survey because of health problems or because of disability or language barriers, so unable to communicate with the interviewer. And so these are the main types of unit non-response. We know that non-response is increasing in all surveys, and we know that attrition is a fact of longitudinal surveys, so some respondents will drop out over time. But this doesn't mean that unit non-response is permanent, so some respondents would participate in the first couple of waves, then drop out from the survey, and then come back again later on. The definition of attrition is discontinued participation of some individuals in a longitudinal survey for reasons that are unknown or beyond the control of the researchers. So in the case of NCDS, this is what happens to the sample. So we started with about 17,400 respondents, and the numbers started to drop from wave 0 onward, and at the end we have about 9,800 respondents in wave 9. So we lost almost 8,000 respondents. And as you can see, in some places, there are a slight increase in the number of respondents. This is between wave 7 and wave 8. In this table, you can see a detailed breakdown of non-response in NCDS. So in wave 0, you can see that there is 1,143 individuals who have not participated, and these are basically the immigrants who have joined the study in wave 1, 2, and 3. And you can see that in the line on the bottom that the total of non-respondents is increasing over time, except between waves 7 and 8, it has declined a little bit. You can see as well that there are different types of non-response. So if you have the non-contact, as I said before, these are the respondents who have not, where the interviewers were unable to establish contact with them. You have refusals, and these are respondents who have refused to participate in the study. You have immigrants. These are respondents who have left the country and never came back. So basically, NCDS does not follow respondents abroad. So anyone who has left the country is no longer eligible to participate in the study. And of course, we have a number of respondents who have unfortunately died, and you can see that the number is increasing over time. And of course, we have a category called not issued, and these are respondents who have not participated in a number of consecutive surveys, and we know that they are unlikely to be to participate in future surveys. So in this case, we no longer issue them, and we no longer try to contact them. So what happens to the sample over time? We know that attrition can be a cause for bias in the sample composition, and that the sample composition might vary over time in terms of the characteristics of the respondents. So here I'm presenting a number of characteristics at birth of the cohort members. So we know if the cohort member is a man. We know whether they were breastfed. We know whether their parents or their fathers belong to the unskilled manual or exercise unskilled manual jobs when the cohort member was born. And we can see that the number of men has declined from about 52% to about 48%. So we have the sample composition is changing over time, and the number of men has declined, the number of women has increased. In a similar way, we see that the number of respondents, or the proportion of respondents whose fathers were exercising unskilled manual jobs at birth in 1958, it has also declined. So another way, we are likely to lose men coming from a socially disadvantaged background. Here you can see as well what happens to those whose mothers were married at birth. So the percentage has decreased and then increased again. So the sample composition has changed over time. And also the proportion of cohort members whose mothers were not living in the southeast has declined over time. So in general, the story is that the sample composition is changing, and there are some slight certain amount of bias caused by attrition. So non-response would in general lead to two main problems. The first one is missing data, so the attrition would lead to smaller samples, and in the case of longitudinal studies, to fewer transitions and incomplete histories, because we will have gaps of information on particular respondents over time, and this would negatively affect any kind of statistical analysis we are doing. The second problem is biases in the results. So as I said, attrition leads to disproportionate representation of some groups. We know that individuals who are mobile or likely to migrate are likely to drop out from the study. Men and disadvantaged respondents, socially disadvantaged, are also likely to drop from the study. Those who exercise, who have long working hours or do night shifts, are also likely to drop out, and so on. So in general, we are losing, attrition does not happen randomly, and we are losing particular type of respondents. And this, of course, would lead to bias in statistical analysis. So what can we do about attrition? Attrition and item missingness. So in general, attrition is dealt with by using attrition weights. So these are weights which are constructed using binary logit response models, and they are equal to the inverse of the probability of participating in the study. So basically, we use a logit response model where the outcome variable is a binary response variable. It takes the value of 1 if the respondent has participated in the study and 0 otherwise. And the explanatory variables would include all kind of interviewer or all kind of respondents characteristics. And from this model, we'd compute the probability of participating in the study, and the weight would be equal to the inverse of this probability. So 1 divided by the probability of participating. So this is the way of dealing with attrition in longitudinal surveys. And the other technique of is multiple imputations, and this is used to deal with item non-response. So basically, the idea here is to fill the gaps of in terms of missing data on particular questions in a particular wave of the survey using multiple imputation models. However, we are not going to dwell too long on these techniques. So. Thank you for your attention, and I'll pass the mic back to. Actually, yeah. So I'll answer your questions, and afterwards Matt will continue with this presentation on mixed mode data from age 55 survey. Okay, this one. Yeah. Are there any technical papers on attrition weights? Yes, there are a couple of technical reports on attrition in NCDS, although we have not constructed weights for NCDS as such. So in the data set you would have there are no weights, but you can find publications for possibly other longitudinal studies managed by CLS, which describe how these weights were constructed. So technical papers on MI, I don't think there are any technical papers on multiple imputations in NCDS, but there are plenty of published papers on multiple imputations in general, and on multiple imputations for other studies managed by CLS, such as the Bridge Core study and the Millennium Cohort study. Are there data sets available with multiple imputations and attrition weights? No. The data sets which are available for so in the public domains are do not contain weights and have not been imputed. So this is left actually to the researchers to do what they want according to the research questions they are trying to answer. We have seen data sets from individual sweeps. Is longitudinal data available including data? No, this is a question which Brian might have answered previously, I think.
We have longitudinal linked data for the childhood period, from birth all the way to age 16, but then from age 16 onwards, the next survey was 23, then 33, and so on. All of those subsequent data sets are available individually, and it's up to you to join them longitudinally yourself.
Okay, so what you suggest if you suspect the missingness is missing not at random using NCDS data. So usually with missing not at random, this means that we have that we don't have all the variables that explain attrition. But this is an assumption that cannot be tested. So in order to use the multiple imputations, we have to the data has to respect the MAR assumption, which is missing at random, but all these assumptions are not tested. So basically, we try to maximize to include all possible variables which might be related to the variable of interest being missing, and which are also related to the variable itself. So this is usually the way we try to deal with missing not at random. But of course, we are never 100% sure about whether it's MNAR or MAR. Thank you.
Okay, so the final session of this webinar, I'm going to talk about using the mixed mode data from the age 55 survey. So the age 55 survey adopted a mixed mode design where respondents were first asked to complete the survey online, and if they didn't, they were contacted by telephone and asked to complete in that way. So this was the first time actually that a mixed mode design has been used on NCDS or any of the other cohorts that we run at CLS. The motivation for doing this was essentially to reduce costs relative to doing a telephone-only survey, which would have been the plan for the age 55 survey had funds been available, but they weren't. So we were confident that it could be done successfully, but evidence from other mixed mode surveys has shown that this approach of mixing modes can have an impact on response rates and also can have an effect on the way in which people respond to questions, so that the mode in which a question is delivered can affect the way in which people respond to survey questions. So we wanted to be sure that we were able to evaluate this properly, and so in order to do that we included an experiment as part of the age 55 survey where a subsample were allocated to a telephone-only approach. And by doing this, we could rigorously assess the impact that the mixed mode approach had on the quality of the data that we collected. So in terms of the response rate that we found, we actually found that the mixed mode approach was much more successful than the telephone-only approach. So the mixed mode response rate was 83%. Compared with 77% on the telephone-only approach. And within the mixed mode group, 62% of respondents completed online, which was much higher than we were anticipating. So we were very pleased about that. I've just seen a question pop up, how large was the telephone-only sample? The telephone-only sample was 1,500 cases out of around about 11,500 issued cases in total. So the mixed mode group was about 10,000 issued cases. So we wanted to check who would actually respond online. What were the characteristics of the people that would respond online? So those are listed here. So amongst online completers, they were more likely to have participated in the most recent survey. No surprise, they were more likely to be regular computer users. They were more likely to be white, to be from higher social classes and to have better health, etc. But what was particularly important was to compare the profile of all of the respondents in the mixed mode group with the profile of those in the telephone-only group. And what we found there was that there were hardly any differences. The only two differences which were significant was that people who participated in the prior survey and non-problematic drinkers were more likely to have participated in the telephone-only group than the mixed mode group. We did find that on some variables there was a difference between the mixed mode group and the telephone-only group in terms of the proportion who were willing to answer particular questions. So the don't know or refusal rate was higher on certain financial questions in the mixed mode group. But on other questions where one might have expected there to have been a difference, such as telling us which party they voted for in the general election, or the number of units of alcohol consumed in the last 7 days, we actually found that there was no difference in the proportion willing to answer the question. Looking at the impact of mode on the responses that people actually gave, So at CLS, we've now compared the mixed mode responses and the telephone-only responses on every variable in the data set. And the good news is that in the main, the differences are not significant at all. Much of the content of the NCDS age 55 survey is very factual, so questions like how many hours do you work, questions about earnings, a number of children at home, etc., that kind of thing. And in terms of responses to those kinds of factual questions, we saw very, very few differences between the mixed mode approach and the telephone-only approach. However, there were a small subset of variables where we did find significant differences between the two data collection strategies, and these differences tended to occur on either rating scale questions, such as the self-rated financial situation, or questions about rating one's well-being, where we found that telephone-only respondents were tending to be more positive than those who were interviewed via the mixed mode approach. So you can see that 40% of people interviewed by telephone only said that they rated their self-rated financial situation. They said that they were living comfortably, compared to 30% in the mixed mode group. And similarly, the telephone-only respondents were more likely to say that they often felt that the future looked good to them, 51% compared to 40%. And the other set of questions where we found some differences were questions which could be affected by a degree of social desirability bias. By that I mean where speaking to an interviewer, respondents might have been more likely to portray themselves in a more positive light. So, for example, the mixed mode group reported a higher level of drinking, and the telephone-only group were more likely to say that they regularly participated in sports. The mixed mode group were also more likely to confess to voting for the Liberal Democrats in 2010 also. So in terms of how to take this into account when conducting analyses, so as I say, we've now compared we've looked into the potential mode effects for every variable in the NCDS-9 data set. And we will very shortly be putting a user guide up onto the UK Data Service site, which will list all of the variables which do seem to have been affected by the mode in which people answered the questions. And our advice would basically be that if you are using any of those variables in your analyses, then we're advising that you add an additional control variable to your analyses, which is a binary variable which indicates whether the respondent completed by web or telephone. And I'm just going to give you a couple of examples to sort of illustrate this in practice. So here we've got the results of a linear regression model looking at how sex and childhood cognition affect the units of alcohol consumed per week at 55. And as I just showed, units of alcohol consumed at 55 does seem to have been affected by mode. So in the first column, we have the results of the regression with no mode indicator. And in the second column, I've put in the mode indicator. And the reassuring thing is that you can see that the inclusion or exclusion of the mode indicator actually seems to make very little difference to the coefficients and the significance of the coefficients. So you can see that the differences between the coefficients in the two models are very small and they're not significant. The next example is a logistic regression where the dependent variable is a binary variable indicating fair or poor self-rated health, which was another variable which did seem to have been affected by mode. And the independent variables in this model are childhood, social class, and sex. And again, the same story basically. We see that there's very, very little difference in terms of the coefficients, in terms of the odds ratio, sorry, between the two models. The differences are very small and not significant, and exactly the same exactly the same independent variables are significant in the models. And one final example, which is a further logistic regression model, where both in this instance the dependent variable is again the binary variable indicating fair or poor self-rated health, and the independent variables this time are units of alcohol consumed per week and sports participation. So both the dependent and both of the independent variables were all seemingly affected by mode. But again, the inclusion or exclusion of the mode indicator in the model is not significantly affecting the results of the regression at all. So, as I mentioned, further guidance will be forthcoming on this. But from the illustrative examples that I've shown you, you can see that I think we're advising to take a cautious approach and to control for the mode in which the respondents completed the survey in regression models. But our take on things so far is that the mode effects are not so significant that they are likely to affect results greatly. But as I mentioned, we'll be shortly issuing the user guide via UKDS, which will list out the variables which do seem to have been affected by mode. If you're conducting analysis which doesn't use any of those variables, then obviously no need to control for mode. But if you are using any of those variables listed in that document, then our suggestion would be that you do control for mode. And we at CLS are currently conducting some much more detailed examination of the impact of mode, and any findings that come out of this work and any further advice to take into account when conducting analyses will be made available via the CLS website. So that's all I wanted to say about the mixed mode nature of the age 55 survey. Got a few questions. Okay, so how long was the survey and its impact on mode of measurement? So yes, the survey was quite short, the NCDS age 55 survey. It was 25 minutes. So that was one of the reasons why we felt confident that the use of the web would be successful. There's limited evidence of successfully running web surveys with a much longer survey length. So our face-to-face sweeps are generally around about an hour. So I think there would be a big question mark over whether it would be possible to do a survey of that kind of length online. But with a 25-minute survey, we were reasonably confident that the web survey would be successful, and it does seem to have been. I think so. Whether the I think there's a question about whether people whether people completed the survey online or by telephone because of convenience to themselves. So basically what happened was that everyone in the mixed mode group was invited to take part online first. They were given 4 weeks to do so, and there were 2 reminders sent to them over those 4 weeks. But they were, in the initial invitation, they were informed that if they didn't take part online, that we would be seeking to contact them via telephone. So essentially, they had the choice over how they participated. How do you reduce the bias by using internet or phone? So hopefully the advice that we've gone through has gone some way to answering that question. But I should also say that we were very, very careful when designing the questionnaire to do as much as we could to ensure that the questions as presented online and via telephone would be interpreted as consistently as possible. So that involved quite a lot of tweaking of questions to make them as compatible as possible across the two modes. So we did as much as we can to ensure that that was the case. What gives you the confidence to suggest that you will achieve greater number of responders at the next sweep? So, I mean, basically, the reason why we're anticipating a larger number next time is the fact that we're doing a face-to-face survey next time, and we typically obtain higher levels of response when we do a face-to-face sweep than when we do a telephone or an online sweep. And
as we saw from Tarek's graph in the response per sweep, after NCDS 7, the response went up for NCDS 8.
Exactly, and the key point is that when we've got interviewers on the ground, when they discover, when they knock on the door of a cohort member and find that that cohort member is no longer living at that address, they can then knock on the neighbour's door and things like that and try and find out information about where that person has gone and maybe able to obtain a new address for them in that way. Whereas when you're doing a telephone survey, that kind of tracing work is that much more difficult. And also it seems to be the case that it's easier to say no to a telephone interviewer or to an invitation to participate in an online survey than it is to say no to someone who's standing on your doorstep. Did you segment your population to determine who are highly likely to respond online? We did some work predicting who would be most likely to participate online, and as I showed, there were particular characteristics which were associated with a higher likelihood of taking part online, none of which were particularly surprising to us. But we did actually invite everyone to participate online, so we didn't really do any segmentation, no. And so I can't see any further questions at this point. So are there...
There was one question earlier about
sorry.
Did the anonymization of the data compromise the analytical capability? I just wanted to clarify that...
In the earlier question about does the anonymization process of the data compromise the analytical capability, I just wanted to clarify that in anonymizing the data, we didn't do any process such as Barnardization, where you actually swap some people's data for other people's data so that it gets mixed up between individuals. The anonymization is simply getting rid of any information which is too much, which would allow somebody to be identified. So if somebody wrote, my job, what is my job? Well, my job is that I'm a operative at the at Imperial Chemical Industries Rock Savage Depot on the first floor. Then we would just reduce that to their occupational code 1 to 350, and that would be, and also their occupational status, whether they're a supervisor or a manager or an ordinary worker. We would delete all the extra information that might have enabled them to be identified. But all of the data for an individual is actually what they put. It's just simply that we anonymize it by not publishing any data that's too disclosive.
Okay, I've just seen another question pop up asking about whether there are unique identifiers in the different sweeps, making linking across the sweeps and data types at the individual level possible. And just to confirm that yes, absolutely, there's the variable NCDS ID, which Brian mentioned earlier, which is in every one of the data sets, and so that's the variable that needs to be used to merge different data sets together. So that brings us to the end of the presentations. We've got a little bit of time left if anyone has any further questions which they'd like to pose via the chat room. We're all still here, so we'll be happy to answer them. I'll just wait to see if any come in. Okay, perhaps not. So there might have been some questions which we missed during the course of the webinar. We'll look through all of the questions which we've been asked, and we'll put some responses together, and we'll get them to you in some way or other that we'll let you know about, perhaps put them on the website or email you a document. This is the first webinar that we've ever conducted on NCDS, so we would very much appreciate any feedback which you could give us, which we will endeavour to take into account when putting together future events of this nature. We'll send you an email with a link to a very short feedback survey. We'd be very grateful if you could complete that for us. And then we've got our contact details up on screen as well, our email address and our telephone number. So do feel free to get in touch with us if you have any questions after the webinar also. Thank you very much for listening.